Good morning, Jeremy.
Now, who have you brought for us this morning?
George Le Couteur, and he's of interest, I think, because there are still people called Le Couteur in this community.
Okay.
And I won't make any illusions about whether they've got cabbage-like heads or not, I did before with Mr. Abeline. But, Mr. Le Couteur was someone who had quite an interesting life and a hard life, as many of the people who were the foundation fathers of our city. So he was born in 1828 on the Isle of Jersey, and he came to Australia on the Duke of Richmond in 1852, arriving in Portland in 1853. But he was a seaman. Prior to that, he'd had quite a hard life, really. His father died when he was only 9, and he commenced work at 12 or 13 years of age in a shipping yard. It was nearly 2 miles from his home, and he worked from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening. And if you sort of appreciate what it's like at the moment in Warrnambool in winter, what it's like at 6 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock at night, it's not...
Sort of dark to dark.
It would be dark to dark. So that would have been pretty tough for a 12 or 13-year-old. But he worked there for several months before he gave that up, and then did some sort of general work among farmers and fishermen, and then he got the opportunity to go to sea, which was something that really interested him. He was only 14 and a half at that stage, and that seems like a fairly a big step to take. But of course people were being taken into the British Navy at that age as well. So, it wasn't unusual. People had to grow up and fend for themselves fairly quickly now, in those days. But he was apprenticed for 5.5 years, and I think was really a pretty good seaman. He sailed chiefly to South America, Rio de Janeiro, Rio Grande, Buenos Aires and Montevideo, and he visited Montevideo when Garibaldi, the Italian patriot, was serving in the Confederate Army, and Sir Charles Hotham, who was later the Governor of Victoria, was Admiral of the British fleet.
Right, okay.
So it was really quite interesting times for him. He would have had quite a broad experience. And at that stage in Montevideo, there were 40 men of war of all nationalities in the harbour there, and 20 of those were British, which perhaps was an illustration of the power of the British Navy at that stage. But he was at sea for quite some time, and then he got back to Jersey, and he visited his mother and his friends and siblings and so forth. And they were pretty pleased to see him because they hadn't seen him for quite some time, and I dare say the email and the phone calls had been pretty few and far between.
Especially those emails.
Yeah. So sometime in 1851 he went on board the Duke of Richmond, and they were sailing with immigrants, and he was working on that ship in the crew, and it was a 144-day journey, quite some significant period of time, and they landed in Portland in March 1852, and he then resigned. And the next bit of his history tells you perhaps why he resigned, because he'd met his wife on the journey, and she was an immigrant, and she was staying, so I dare say that would have had some influence on what actions he took. So he left his seaman's life, and he went to Warrnambool, where he worked on the lighters. And in those days, very early days, the town was only a few tents, and he lived in a house that had the first iron roof on it in town. So we talked a while ago about Mrs. Abeline and having the first chair in the region. Well, George Le Couteur lived under an iron roof, which made him a person of some interest as well. But he went to live at Warrnambool. He was a very staunch Methodist supporter, and he was the prime mover in building of the church in Warrnambool that has now been moved to Simpson. I don't know whether anybody knows whether that church that was moved from Wangoom to Simpson is still there, and whether it serves as a hay shed or maybe somebody's house. I don't know about that. But he certainly spent quite a lot of time in the Heytesbury Forest, and he made his home at Curdy's River, and certainly very interested still in his church. But it's interesting that when Frances Le Couteur died in 1903, she died at Ridgevale, Nullawarre, and I suppose that would have been a respecting of her maiden name. She was a Ridgway.
Right.
And so the Ridgevale, I think, would have been a reflection of her early history. And she was said to be a colonist of 50 years. And she left a grown-up family of 13 sons and 1 daughter.
Wow.
So that's a significant effort in her own right. I think that she should have been on the board.
Yes.
Interesting.
Have her own pioneer board with that many offspring.
Yes. Well, as a result of that sort of offspring, George Thomas, the first son of Francis Ridgway and George Le Couteur, they had a son called Philip Ridgway Le Couteur, and he became a Rhodes Scholar, and he's one of just 4 connected to Warrnambool. So the influence of George Le Couteur has been significant in the area.
All right. Oh, very nice. Fascinating story. Glenys, thank you again.
Thank you.